Tell me, what is spiritual abuse?
People might take the word of God out of context to abuse you, to manipulate you, to control you. My biggest struggle was, Lord, how can I forgive them when I've never heard an I'm sorry? It was like my world collapsed a little bit at that moment.
So what are the other areas of spiritual abuse and how can we recognize them?
I have 35 signs of spiritually abusive and toxic leadership, yeah.
How did you trust again?
Come to the realization that I had been lied to, that I had been told something that wasn't true, was devastating.
Hey, welcome everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for coming back to watch and listen to Authentic Turning Point. Today I'm with my guest, Francesca McDowall, leadership and public speaking coach. Francesca, thank you so much for coming. Oh, do you know what? She's traveled an hour and a half down from way out down to us here, way out again to get to us. So I'm really, really grateful for you taking the journey.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Andrea.
Thank you so much. So you know what we're going to talk about. We're talking about you. This is space for you today. We're talking about your story, your turning points. I know many of us have many turning points. And I will ask you about the turning point that's had the most impact on your life further down in our conversation. Sure. So Fran, where do you want to start? It's totally up to you.
So I'll start by maybe sharing how actually we met, which is through your Authentic Women's event. So that was earlier on this year. And at the time I'd recently relocated areas and was looking for new community, and then came across you and the group that you were running. And just to kind of get connected in with women, I feel is so important, particularly when you work for yourself and you don't have colleagues around you, just the importance of community.
Excellent. So let's go back to your childhood. Let's go back to your childhood. Tell me about Fran.
Yeah, so I am the youngest of two. So I have an older brother. And I would say I grew up in a very stable family, almost a 2.4 children, me, my older brother, and a cat in our family. And I didn't actually know I grew up in a very secure and safe environment until I actually was a lot older. I didn't know that I grew up in an environment where I didn't have to ever think or be concerned about where we might sleep or what we might eat or how the bills were being paid. You know, my childhood was very almost wrapped in cotton wool. And to some extent, it was a beautiful experience, but I do think that it caused me to be quite naive as I went into my young adulthood. So growing up, life was great with my family. We did family things together. I was very involved in extracurricular activities. So I did ballet, I did play the violin, I did the girls' brigade, the guys, like all of the activities you could do, I did. And it was very good for my personal development. You know, I joined school, I did well at school. And yeah, I then decided that educational psychology would be my career pursuit. So I did my undergraduate in psychology and left home. And that for me was a real wake-up call to real life.
Wow, tell me about that wake-up call.
So moving from what we might call the suburbs in a really green community, I think the first thing I realized when life was not going to be the same was I was told as a student I'll be moving to a 3-bedroomed house. So in my head, I had this picture of a beautiful, detached, large 3-bedroomed house, literally down this winding road with trees and everything else. And when they drove me into a housing estate in South London, I cried because I couldn't understand that this is what I would be living. I'd never heard of a maisonette. The fact that I thought I'd be living, you know, above another house, everything felt very strange to me. So that was a real wake-up call to the reality of life in different ways. And I learned to pray. I never prayed so hard in my life because everything was really overwhelming and it was really, really different, you know. So it was challenging, really challenging. But I got through my degree. So I did my undergraduate, like I said, in psychology. And then from there, moved to the Midlands with some friends at that time who had started a church in the area. So I almost felt like my life was really one way in the beginning. And then from 18 onwards, it took a very different turn with studying and moving out and meeting different people. It was really, really different.
Oh, great. Yeah. So tell me about the different turn that it took. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah. So my faith had always been important. I was made a commitment to Christ when I was about 14 and got baptized at 15 and was really involved in church activities. And then when I did move to London, I got really involved with a church at the time there. And then it just became such a huge part of my life. So I did university, did a bit of work, and then I did church. And so even then moving to a different part of the country, it was because of church, because of being linked with a big family in the church. And that was the main focus. And we had services on a Friday, on a Saturday, and a Sunday, morning and afternoon and evening.
Wow. Oh, wow.
So, and at the time I was like, wow, look at all of this service unto the Lord. And it was the biggest part of my life.
So you're saying from the age of 14, right the way up to when you left to go to university, a lot of your life was within the church, that community. So it sounds like that became quite a big anchor for you in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So developing a personal faith was really important. But as a teenager living at home and in the church I grew up in, which was more of a charismatic church, there was definitely, now what I can look back and say, there was balance. So yeah, we had church on a Sunday morning, but you had family time, you did other activities, there were social elements to it. And I'm grateful because my personal faith was real to me. So I did read my own Bible. I did pray. I've developed a relationship with God. And then at 18, it was then really consuming.
Consuming?
Yeah. But at the time, I didn't know it was really consuming. So consuming in the sense that how much more I got involved in church almost consumed most of my life.
Was that a good thing?
At the time, I thought so. Yeah. At the time, I was really passionate and enthusiastic, and I did. And although, my family were always questioning, you're at church again and things like that, I think the response was always, yeah, but this is God, this is for the kingdom.
Okay. So your parents weren't there with you. So some families, they may begin to attend the church, and sometimes it's the whole family. Actually, sometimes it's the parents that's dragging the children to come until they get to their own mind and think, no, I don't want to be coming so often. Actually, I want to go or whatever, or go to a different place, or leave the church totally. So in your case, was it that you were just going on your own, or was your parents coming with you?
So my dad wasn't saved at that time. Yeah. So my mum was coming, and she was also quite involved. So we were kind of in it together initially. And then when I left university and moved to a different city, then obviously she stayed in her hometown.
Yeah. So when you left your hometown to go to Southeast London in that estate, how did you navigate that transition from the anchor of that, because that was quite a big community or an important community for you that you'd moved out of together, even from your family, into a new community, having to get to know new people, a whole new environment that sometimes people call London concrete city, didn't they? So you've left all these beautiful fields, you've gone into this new place.
Yeah.
Tell me about Fran's self-talk at that point. What was happening there? What was you saying, Francesca?
I think it was just survive. But I think I threw myself into a new community, and actually I didn't keep in close contact with people outside of my family. So people I grew up with, went to church with, went to other activities with. I didn't keep in touch with a lot of people because I actually think I needed to be fully integrated in order to survive. So to find stability in a new community. So I literally just jumped with everything right in the middle of it. So I got involved, joined the choir, traveled with the church to do mission work and served in different ways.
So this was a new church community?
Yes.
Oh, so you had the church community when you was 14?
Yeah.
Which was in your hometown?
Yeah.
Then when you moved to London, you found a new church community?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was quite a different church, more of a Pentecostal, majority African, quite a spiritual style church, I would say.
Oh, wow. Okay. So what made you decide to find a church community? Why not just a community at your local pub or your local, centre in the area, or
even with with the students as well.
Yeah, or just or student life. What made you decide to continue within a church community? What was that about?
Because church was a really strong part of my community, And my mum had actually had a dream about me going to this church. It was one of those things where, on hindsight, I've had to really reflect on the journey and I think trust God with how things transpired. But initially, my mum had a dream that I went to this meeting, and she was like, I really feel like I need to take you. And I was like, you're my mum, I trust you, we'll go together. And everything she dreamt that happened to me at this church happened at the church. And so we really took that both as a bit of an indication. Maybe this is where we're meant to be, learn some new things. So it wasn't, I almost felt like it just happened and I just kind of got swept along with being in there, versus making a conscious decision that, yeah, this is the place for me.
And what impact did that new community have on your life now in London?
So I was at university to study, and I didn't build community within university or within my peers or colleagues. And so I don't feel I didn't get that undergraduate experience where I went out with people and just had student fun. It was very much you study and then you're involved in church because of the level of commitment and the services they had. So they would have, like I said, Friday, Saturday, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and then prayer meetings and all night services. And I just threw myself in.
Yeah. And why do you think you say I just threw myself in? Why do you think you just threw yourself in?
Because I found belonging. I found a sense of, okay, this is different. This feels okay, and people need to belong somewhere. And that's, for me, the place that I found a sense of belonging. And then I began to form friendships through the church and, again, community.
You've written a book on surviving spiritual abuse.
Yeah, definitely.
Tell me a bit about that.
Sure. So I think I'll kind of work backwards. So in lockdown, I was in a different church than the one that I mentioned about. Yeah, let's call this my healthy church. I was in a really healthy church. I've been in there for a number of years. And I always feel like I was just minding my own business in worship. And I literally saw the words surviving spiritual abuse. And I knew inside that is the book the Lord had wanted me to write, because I was writing at the time, but this was what he wanted me to write next. And I was like, nah, thanks, but no thanks. And so it wouldn't leave me though. And I think when you have a faith and you know God, you know the voice of God. And I know that this wouldn't have been my idea, because who wants to write a book about abuse and write their own story for the world to read? And so I battled with that for a month or two. Here in the UK, lockdown happened. I lost a lot of the work that I was doing as a coach and consultant. And so I started writing this book. And in essence, it shares the story of things that I went through, but I didn't know that I was going through at that time. So I want to say about 10 years now, or 10 years prior to writing, again, I was in church in a different service, and just really heard the Lord say in my spirit, it's time to go. And I knew that he was telling me it was time to leave that church that I'd, at that point, then been in for about 10 years.
Is that the church that you'd gone into when you left your hometown or went into study?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was firstly in London, and then I moved to a different city with that same church. So I'd been in there for 10 years, really involved, like it was my life. Everything about it was connected to me. Like I went to that city because of the church and the family I was really associated with, and lots of things happened, but I didn't know that they weren't okay until I'd actually left the church. Okay. And I think sometimes we go through life, and one of the best ways I can describe it is, if you put a frog, how do you boil a frog? That analogy. You put it in a pan of hot water, it jumps out immediately. When you put it in a pan of cold water and you turn it up slowly, so over weeks, months and years, it then acclimatizes and it will cook itself to death. And I feel like that is my own experience of experiencing spiritual abuse, because I didn't know that I was in an environment that was very unhealthy, some very toxic traits, until I came out of it.
Tell me, what is spiritual abuse?
So spiritual abuse, one of the ways it can be described is any form of abuse, like we speak normally about the physical and verbal and emotional and even sexual abuse, but it happens because of being in a faith community. And so people might take the word of God out of context to abuse you, to manipulate you, to control you, or they might financially do something. And so it can happen between leaders, or the majority of ways it happens where a leader will abuse a member of their congregation. And it's very, very damaging. And so one of the big things that happened to me, and like I said, at the time, I didn't know that it was wrong.
Yeah.
Because when you're in a relationship with people, there's so much trust there. And again, the church community and culture was, the leaders are the leaders. Like, they're in charge. They're the men and women of God. They're the ministers. And what they say goes. Yeah. And there's no culture of discussion or challenge.
So it just becomes normalized.
Absolutely. So a situation happened. I was serving as a trainee minister at the time. And something had happened. And I said to the leadership, I said, I need to step down from leading. Things aren't going the way that I would, things aren't really right for me at the moment. I need to step down. And so I had a discussion with the pastor, and he said, okay, he had the whole story of what had happened. And he said, well, he said a few things, but then he said, how we'll get reconciliation between me and you and God is if you pay a sin offering. So I was like, just listening, because this is my pastor. This is somebody who has been overseeing and teaching me for years, like there's just so much relationship there. I saw him like an older brother, actually. So he said that. He suggested the amount I should put as a sin offering. A few days later, I went to the cash machine or the ATM and withdrew that amount of money, came back into the church office and handed it over, and he prayed. And it was almost like, this is the symbolism of how you will be reconciled with God. And so that was quite a significant thing that happened. Nobody else knew about it, so it was kept very private. I was off from ministering actively for about a month, and then life carried on as normal. But I was really distressed and I was not in a good place, I don't think, spiritually, mentally, emotionally at all. But we paid this sin offering, and so everything was meant to be okay. So that happened. A year later, the Lord told me to leave the church. It wasn't until a year later that I was in a Bible study, an independent Bible study led by this incredible, mature woman. And we were going through righteousness and going through one of Derek Prince's books. And how it would work is we'd kind of sit in her living room and people would take it in turns to read parts of the book. And so then we're reading, and someone is reading the book and sharing how, because of the sacrifice of Jesus, a lot of the Old Testament offerings were no longer needed. And they read the wave offering and the grain offering, and then they read out the sin offering. And I was like, wait, what? So I kind of went back and read it again. And I literally felt like everything in that moment froze. Because on the one hand, I'm reading that this thing was no longer needed, but yet I'm remembering that, but hey, just a little while ago, I was told I had to do this. So I had a chat with a Bible study teacher privately and explained to her the situation. And then when I said to her I had to pay a sin offering, she was like, oh, what? What's a sin offering? And I told her, and she pulled out her Bible and we read it together. And it was like my world collapsed a little bit at that moment, because to come to the realization that I had been lied to, that I had been told something that wasn't true, was devastating. And I was really distressed. And I was also really angry, because I was thinking, how dare you? How could you? Right? You know, when someone is vulnerable and they're in a really tough season, you then use that to extort money, right? And then when I spoke to a couple of people, they were like, well, maybe they didn't know. And I was like, maybe, but maybe they did, right? Because how come it was so private? So I really had to go through a season of forgiveness and healing, and almost learning that a lot of what I thought was true about my life wasn't actually true. And it wasn't until being in the New Healthy Church that, as I began to share certain experiences, the then pastor, so my new pastor, he had said, Fran, that's not normal. The things you've gone through, that is actually spiritual abuse. You were controlled and manipulated and, I don't want to say forced, but you were coerced into doing a lot of things that were really, really wrong. And it was so painful, particularly because I had nowhere to go to get answers. There was no one I could really talk to about it. I read a couple of books about it, which was really helpful, but it was like my life hasn't been what I thought it was. And that was hard.
And how did you get to a place of forgiveness?
With a lot of struggle. My biggest struggle was, Lord, how can I forgive them when I've never heard an I'm sorry? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? And I was really thinking, well, they've never acknowledged it. They've never said sorry. I'm not in a place to go back and challenge them about it because I was so broken, because there were a few other things that happened as well that were really, really distressing. So just walking that journey with God took a lot of time and journaling and praying and counseling until I got to a place of forgiveness. But what I did do a lot, I imagined in my head the scenario of if I saw them again, what I might say and what I might do. And I had come up with that whole range of scenarios. And interestingly, during the season of writing the book, I did happen to bump into the previous pastor who had asked me to pay the sin offering. And at that moment, I knew I'd forgive him because there was no need for me to challenge him or to question him. I was very happy to see that he was well and his family were well. And so that was really helpful.
As you're on, you've mentioned your own experience and there's other experiences. So you talked about that's like a financial abuse, would you say? So what are the other areas of spiritual abuse and how can we recognize them?
Yeah, there are so many areas. I think one thing that's really important to think about is how was Jesus, and like what does he do versus how are the leaders? And so there's a time in scripture when a lot of the disciples stopped following Jesus because they didn't believe what he said, and he let them go. He let them make their own decision whether to follow him or not. And I think sometimes we experience in church and faith communities where the leaders are so insistent and they will do anything to convince you of something, and they'll almost try and stop you from leaving because they believe that church is the place where God is, and if you're not here, well then you're no longer with God. And they can have a very elitist attitude and an elitist approach. If you as an adult don't feel able to make decisions about your own life without taking it to the pastor, that could be a sign of spiritual abuse. And so in the book, I share my own story, but I also share the story of 6 other people who've gone through different forms of spiritual abuse. And there was one lady who'd gone to her pastor for counselling, she's having some marital issues, and the pastor told her to get a divorce because he said that's what God said. They got the divorce based on his say-so, and then she was so unhappy, and she came back to the pastor and said, I'm not sure I made the right decision. Why did you tell me to get a divorce? He said, because I thought that's what you wanted to hear. And so she trusted his say-so, not thinking that he heard from God when he just pretty much gave his own opinion, you know? And we have other individuals who have been sexually assaulted by leaders in church or have been bullied, you know, made to feel like nothing because they didn't comply with what they wanted. And so those things are really, really devastating. I think if there's lots of secrecy in church, that's a bit of a red flag. Okay. Yeah, if people are saying things such as, all God's glory will leave you if you're not in this church, that's a big red flag because that's not kingdom, right? That's not what we see in scripture. So yeah, I mean, I have 35 signs of spiritually abusive and toxic leadership, yeah. And I know for some people, they have read it and have been like, I didn't know that that's what I was in. I thought this was normal. I thought this was okay. Yeah.
How did you take back your, for want of a better word, your power, your responsibility? How did you take back ownership of, and responsibility for what had happened and begin to like walk forward in, 100% this being your responsibility to move forward? How did you take that back? How did you?
Yeah, again, it was definitely a process over time because I think my life was so entwined in that community that it was an unlearning and an untwining process. So definitely having support and safe voices around me, giving myself permission to grieve the loss of those very significant relationships as well. And then also being in a new church and actually sitting down and doing nothing.
How did you trust again?
Oh, I didn't initially. Like, I'd sat in my new church, cynical and skeptical, with my arms folded, hypothetically, and just waiting for the leadership to mess up, just waiting for them to make a mistake so I could be proven wrong that all leaders are like this. And at the beginning, you introduced that I'm a leadership coach. I'm called to leaders, yet I struggled with leaders. I didn't like leaders. I didn't understand them. I didn't want to be around them. But God gave me two pastors, so the pastor and his wife, who were phenomenal, and they were so Christ-like, and they demanded nothing from me. And so they took me out for coffee, and I'd been in the church for a few months, or maybe it was about a year or so, and they said, "How can we serve you?" And my brain just didn't understand the question, because I'd been a Christian for years and I'd never been asked that question. Yeah. And so, when something is brand new, it just bounces off your brain because there's nowhere for it to land. And so I was like, I don't understand. Aren't you meant to ask me how I can serve the church, what my gifting is, how I can be used, where I want to serve? Yeah. But they said, how can we serve you? And in that moment, there was a depth of healing that I didn't even know I needed, because I realized that they didn't have an agenda. They weren't there just to fleece what they could out of my life, but they really wanted to serve me. And their consistency and their faithfulness was such a big part of my healing journey. And they actually said, we do not want you to serve. So I had to come out of almost the performance culture as well, where I believed that I needed to perform and to do, and even to be serving God to make sure that he still loved me. And so it was the most painful, raw journey of my life. And it took several years. And so when I was told to write the book, it was almost like reliving it, because now I'm writing it in black and white. And the older version of Fran was really compassionate with the younger version of Fran. So I was able to have understanding for what I went through, because I didn't know any better and I didn't know any different. Yeah. And I think when we go through certain things, we have to be compassionate. Because I could say, well, how could you not have known? Or how could you not have realized? I mean, isn't it obvious? But when you're in it, you don't see what's going on around you.
The principles that you've mentioned about, spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
What else could this abuse be likened unto? So if we take it out of the context of the church, because this is written in the context of spiritual abuse, the church, maybe,
yes,
right?
Yes.
If we took it out of the context of the church, where else would we find this?
Domestic abuse and domestic violence, yeah. And actually, for some people, that explains it perfectly, because it's in a closed community in somebody's home, and other people see a very different picture of what's happening on the inside. Because the other thing that's really apparent within spiritually abusive and toxic leadership is they are the most charismatic, loving, appealing people to so many other people other than those that they are abusive to. So for some people who know me personally, they couldn't believe some of what I wrote in the book. And even within my own family, they could, because the version of the leader that they saw was so completely different. And we see that in domestic violence, where we'll use the typical example where it's a man that's abusive to his wife. In the workplace, he's amazing. He's a great boss. He's a great leader. Yet in the home environment, he's a very different person. And again, if she had been groomed into that scenario, she takes responsibility that it's my fault, or this is because of me.
If you were speaking to a leader right now who is unaware of, actually, do you know that you are abusing the people that are following you, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the church, whether it's a mother who's a leader or a father, because these are principles that can rock and roll in any environment.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you to speak to the person who could be the abuser, not realizing that they're actually abusing. I haven't studied in relation to what abusers go through, etc., but I know for sure that it's usually from a place of some kind of fear, wanting to control, etc. And this could be coming from a really far place from childhood, that they don't realise that this is what they do.
or it could be somebody who have just experienced something, and because of that experience in their adulthood, it's caused them to begin to abuse individuals in certain situations because of maybe that root of fear. What would you say to that person who, to help them to identify that they are doing this? What would you say to them to help them to identify it, and then what do they need to do?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the first thing is to take a pause and to speak to a leader, a good, healthy Christian leader outside of your immediate church environment, because we find that if there's toxicity in one place, well, then there can be very strange cultures. And so to speak to somebody outside and just talk and share about their own behavior, their conduct, the things that are being done, and just to get an outside perspective on how appropriate and how scriptural those things are. And then from there, decide if they can remain in that place. And if so, what needs to change in order for them to ensure that they are treating God's children with the utmost love, respect, and honor that they deserve. Because actually, a shepherd takes care of the sheep. They do everything they can do to serve and to help the sheep survive and do well. They don't cause harm and damage. And so what does that look like for them? Do they need to be in therapy? Do they need to walk through their own process of healing? And is leadership the right place for them? Because are they serving in leadership, or is it more about them? Have they gotten the position because everyone in our family are leaders and we're pastors, or I'm going to pass it down to my son, my nephew, my grandchild? Does that make sense? Like, have they really been called to serve? Because if they have, we should see in their life the fruit of the Spirit. The gifts are one thing, but it's the fruit of the Spirit that we really want to see. Do we see the aspects of godly leadership?
So in you saying that, if we're talking Bible, because I just mentioned it could be in different contexts, right?
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
let's talk about Bible. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about different characteristics, we've got the Davids, we've got the Abrahams, we've got all those guys who fell, who messed up. So is it that if a leader is abusing, spiritual abusing, that they're not a leader because these other guys messed up?
Yeah.
So what's your take on that situation?
Yeah. So I actually write a letter at the back of the book, and it's called A Letter to Leaders, and I explain that there is.
I haven't read the book yet, by the way. So
there is room, there is grace, there is forgiveness after repentance. And so if people are humble enough to say, actually, you know what, I've been doing it wrong and I've been messy, I haven't handled people well, like you said, within any capacity, and they're willing to change, absolutely there is room for them to still lead. Because I also think that people can come under challenges when they're called to a particular position, and that can look differently for different people, right? And so most people don't start off by being abusive and controlling and toxic. Things happen. Yeah. They go through their own trauma and they don't see it, and they carry on leading in a very unhealthy way.
Yeah.
And so I have personally spoken to leaders who have been challenged in different ways, right? Amazing. And I don't think any, and of course we say that no leader is perfect, but there is an element of healthy where people aren't being damaged.
Yeah.
And some of the damage is shocking. I work with people who've said, I have not been able to pick up my Bible because of the way it's been used to verbally bash me or assault me, right? Yeah. People who've been terrified to speak to people outside of their own church community because they've been told, well, if you do, these things are going to happen to you.
What would you say to those people?
That they are so loved and that they are loved by God more so than their leader.
What do they need to do now?
They need to do what they need to make themselves safe. Make yourself safe. Because if going into a church community is giving you anxiety and a panic attack or fear is rising, how is that healthy and how is that right? I don't believe it's God's best for us. And so absolutely there is healing and there is restoration that is available, really and truly.
Francesca, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know we have kind of, spoke a lot about spiritual abuse You shared your experience. What I love about what Fran is, can I call you Fran? I've been calling you Fran.
Absolutely, yeah.
What Fran? I'm calling you Fran. Fran's my friend now. What I love about what Fran's saying is she's come and she shared her story about spiritual abuse, and she's also shared how she's been healed, which means if you've gone through or you're going through it, you can get out like Fran did, and you can also, you know, experience that healing. I want to just ask you, as we wrap up, tell me about your authentic turning point in this situation. As we've been talking about spiritual abuse, tell me about the authentic turning point that impacted this experience in your life.
Yeah. When I made the decision to obey God in writing this book and sharing my story with the world, because I had to ask myself, is it really about me? And if I'm really healed enough to make it no longer my story. And as hard and as painful as it was, and I had very little support because people were like, you can't do that, you can't expose the church in this way. My obedience to God impacted my life in such an incredible way. But more than that, it's the lives that have been impacted internationally through hearing about the book, or getting connected on social media, or just realizing that they are not alone in what they've been through, that they are not going crazy, that they're not, they're not going crazy, they're not alone, and they're not wrong for thinking that something is really, really wrong. And I'm so grateful for being willing to be vulnerable.
Amazing.
You know, and just realizing that our vulnerability can help other people in ways that we could never have imagined. Because I've never even met half the people who I speak to or who read the book in person.
Yeah.
But that story is changing their life.
Amazing.
And I'd also say that I think God maturing me to realize that if people were to be really critical of the book, which they have been at times, I am not the book. I am me, you know, made in God's image. And actually that is the book. So to separate out sometimes ourselves from the things we've been through in order to help and serve other people, again, at the most appropriate time.
Fantastic. Yeah, I just want to pull one more thing out as we wrap up, because you just covered something else for me there. So I know we've been talking about spiritual abuse, and you just mentioned about your turning point being writing that book.
Yeah.
And what you had to go through because of all the voices and the opinions and the critical opinions, etc., of individuals. But yet still you did what you heard, and you've written the book.
Yeah.
The book is here to prove. Yeah. There's many other books out there that needs to be written that hasn't been written.
Yeah.
There's many other projects out there that are within individuals that has not been birthed, or not even one action's been taken yet. This was your project. This was one of your birthings. To somebody who's been hearing, write that book. Even though you are uncomfortable and you're thinking about the critics, start that project. Go speak to that person.
Yeah.
What would you say to that person to help them to release?
Yeah. I always feel like this is with my coach hat on. I would really say, think about the lives that are going to be transformed at the end of it. Because often it's what we think about ourselves that stop us and hold us back because of what we think about ourselves. But when we realize that everything we're called to do is going to impact other people's lives, that should be our driving force, because we can change generations through our obedience. And actually, interestingly, let me say, on the day I was doing the book launch, a lady said, "Oh, I've written a book about surviving spiritual abuse." And I was like really shocked, because I know her within my local community. And so I was thinking, oh my gosh, will she think that I've copied her book title? I went onto Amazon, researched it, couldn't find it. And I said to her, I can't find your book. She says, it's not written yet, but God told me to do it. And she was so convicted because God told her to write a book, but she hadn't yet done it. Yeah. And actually, we're so unique. There's something that you can bring in a way that only you can bring it. Yeah. And everyone has a place. Everyone has a people they're called to serve, and it can change their life. And so why not you? And why not now?
Amazing. I love that. I want to say thanks so much again, Francesca, for coming over all the way from way back where, coming here today. And I want to also say thank you so much for listening in with myself, Andrea Graham, and my guest, Francesca McDowall. Remember what Fran has said today. Why not you? And why not now? And I also want to say to you, remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bless you.